Part 3, Issues, Culture, Cat and Mouse, Chapter 15. In this country, all real poetry is outrageous. Nadezhda Mandelstam, Hope Against Hope. The scene outside the Moscow Writers' Club was a madhouse, like New York at the return of Bob Dylan, or Bobby Soxer's mobbing Frank Sinatra in his heyday as a matinee idol. University co-eds in slick imported raincoats ignored the spring drizzle and swarmed around latecomers begging for a ticket. Celebrities were beginning to gather, and the police, to keep order, called internal security troops as reinforcements. Squeezing through the crush, I lost Anne's grip, barely caught it again, and literally had to haul her through the human whirlpool to make it into the building. Inside, the audience of several hundred was restlessly expectant. People were crowding the aisles or snatching each other's seats. We saw Maya Plestekaya, the Bolshoi Ballet's prima ballerina, and her husband Rodion Shchedrin a few rows ahead. Near them was Arkady Raikin, the comedian, and Viktor Sokolrodrev, Brezhnev's handsome, wavy-haired personal interpreter for summit meetings with presidents and prime ministers. But mostly it was a young audience, gentle, mauve, or shaggy-haired, the sons and daughters of the cultural and political elite, drawn by one of those special rituals of Russian cultural life, a rare poetry reading by one of the leading liberal poets, Andrei Voznesenskiy. The evening began in a bow to convention with Voznesenskiy's modern patriotic oratory to Russia performed by about 80 voices from the Soviet radio and television chorus. It was well performed, but the audience was only mildly appreciative. This was not what they had come for. Gingerly, a half a dozen actors and actresses edged into singing and reading some of Voznesenskiy's whimsical and non-controversial verses, and the assembly was politely amused, growing more expectant. Then suddenly came an upward, daring vault toward the political high-wire with a poem, read by one actor about Vsevolod Meyerhold, the avant-garde theater director who perished in a Stalinist camp in 1940. Without mentioning Stalin or the purges directly, Voznesenskiy's verse evoked Meyerhold's desolate death somewhere in the Gulag archipelago. Where is your grave, or maybe just a mound, Vsevolod Emilievich Meyerhold? Where can we put a monument? There is no grave. You cannot be frozen into a statue like some docile teacher's pet. You blaze from the pedestals of the world stage. Vsevolod Emilievich Meyerhold. Just as in the wave of poetry readings that swept Moscow in the late 50s and early 60s, the sudden fusion of art and politics and the poet's resurrection of a forbidden topic brought the audience to life. This was what they had come to see, how far Voznesenskiy would test and challenge the taboos. For Meyerhold, one of the most gifted and radical innovators of the early Soviet theater world, is officially canonized, but his death and the fact that he was punished for the heresy of anti-ideological artistic formalism are buried in silence. At Voznesenskiy's allusion to Meyerhold's free spirit, the audience broke into rhythmic applause. Yuri Lyubimov, director of the Taganka Theater, which reveres Meyerhold as the godfather of its own experimentalism, rushed to embrace Vozninsky warmly. More waves of applause. Through the first half of the performance, the poet himself sat on stage, but off to one side, his face, still boyish at 41, showing pained embarrassment, but dapper in a houndstooth sport jacket, blue velvet slacks, and a fullered scarf. He emerged after intermission to hush a new flow of gate crashers. By then the overflow crowd was standing in the aisle near center stage, rapt and enthusiastic. Voznesenski's shyness melted. He answered their unspoken expectations with his hip lingo satire on the anti-humanism of the technological revolution, ending on a nicely turned poetic plea not to make artificial caviar out of oil, but to make oil flow from natural caviar. He touched them deeply by his celebration in verse of the return to Russia of Mark Chagall, so long a Soviet pariah, and then from an early work, Anti-Worlds, Voznesensky invoked his perennial protest against censors who have choked the throats of poets from Cervantes to Pasternak. Amen, I have killed a poem, killed it unborn, to hell with it, we bury poems, come see, we bury. The audience was completely his by now. He dallied with some whimsical ditties, and then tickled them with a poem that made fun of the endless keying up in Soviet life, the signing up years in advance for defenstany goods, and even inking numbers on your wrist to prove your place into the self-appointed busybodies who monitor Soviet lines. I am 41st for Plisetskaya, 33rd for the theater at Taganka, 45th for the graveyard at Vagankovo. I am 14th for the eye specialist, 21st for Glazyunov, the artist, 45th for an abortion. When my turn comes, I'll be in shape. I am 103rd for auto parts. They signed me up when I was born. I am 10,007th for a new car. They signed me up before I was born. What pleased them most, however, was the irreverence of his retort to cultural watchdogs and prudish party hacks who had been chiding him for sexual imagery and pornographic language in some of his verses. Hoisting them on their own petard, Voznesensky denounced pornography of the spirit. A girlfriend dances in public with a naked admirer. Hail pornography of the flesh, but there is also pornography of the spirit. Sometimes during a lecture, a functionary is a competent in his art as a cook, and reveals to his audience his pornography of the spirit. In a Picasso to him, everything is unclear, and Shostakovich has no ear. This kind of humbug would embarrass even a Paris whore. The crowd in the aisles surged forward, passing flowers of adulation to Voznesensky, who was allowed to give only 3 such performances during our time in Moscow. He was besieged by autograph hunters, while rhythmic applause echoed in the hall. The enthusiasm that night, it seemed to me, symbolized the craving of the Soviet intelligentsia for a few moments of mischievous disobedience and candor, little morsels of free expression liberated from the cheap cheerfulness and stifling dogmatism of orthodox writing, beside the stark moral probing or lacerating social criticism of such Western writers as Beckett, Pinter, Albee, or Baldwin, Voznesensky, and other Soviet establishment liberals often seem like boys sticking out saucy tongues at the authorities rather than delivering literary body blows to the moral solar plexus of their society. Yet there is so much in Soviet culture that is hackneyed, false, and crudely sloganistic that any quiet voice of honesty or fleeting independence from the dictates of politics catches the ear like a whisper in a library. Nowhere else in the world is poetry accorded such religious reverence, or the poet so celebrated as priest and oracle as in Russia. If ordinary people escape into alcoholism, intellectuals flee into books, especially poetry, finding there the spiritual compensation for the ennui of ordinary life. We have no philosophers or political commentators in your sense, no folk singers with moral messages, and no religion for most people. Voznesensky observed to Anne and me one evening as he sat drinking Georgian wine in his favorite costume, a leather jacket and jeans, lounging on a low couch in his untidy, high-ceilinged apartment. So there is a vacuum. People need something for their spirit, and they turn to poets. Some come for entertainment, and others for religion, or politics, or philosophy. They expect all this from the poet. That's why he is so important in Russia, and he always has been under Tsarism, as well as communism, for daring poetry or daring art of any kind teeters on the line of confrontation between tyranny and talent, where censorship and creativity inevitably collide. People come to a poetry reading to see how far the poet dares defy the political laws of gravity, and whether he will keep his balance on the high wire, or lose it and suffer the political consequences. This becomes a cat-and-mouse game between authority and the intelligentsia, natural enemies throughout Russian history. For Russian audiences, this game provides the main source of tension and flavor and amusement in the otherwise muted and muffled Soviet cultural sense. It is, of course, an unequal game, just as it was in Pushkin's day or Dostoevsky's, in which the state and its cultural watchdogs have the ultimate sanctions of approval or punishment, and the intelligentsia can arm themselves only with wit, courage, and imagination. It is a game of cunning played with ruses and subterfuges, allegories and Aesopian language, hidden meanings and significant inflections, which dramas performed one way to soothe the censors and another way to excite live audiences. Strangely, it is a game in which writers told me the rules in Moscow differ from those in the provinces, because censors in some provincial cities are more lenient or more awed by big-name authors than are the hard-nosed censors of Moscow. This sometimes makes certain issues of provincial magazines more interesting than the better-known journals of Moscow. In the same way, what often passes as underground, nonconformist art in the stricter ideological climate of Moscow has long been discreetly accepted in Estonia, Lithuania, or Latvia, where the arts had already absorbed modernist abstract trends before the Baltic states were joined during World War II to Stalin's Russia, which had been stolidly plodding along with socialist realism as its cultural banner. It is a game where the size of the audience is vitally important, because the watchdogs can afford a margin of error at small theaters where the audience is reckoned in hundreds rather than millions. The larger the audience, the tighter the controls, a movie script writer groaned to me. They worry a great deal about anything for a mass audience. That's why our television is so terribly dull and the movies are not much better. The game is a constant struggle between liberals maneuvering for more elbow room and conservatives trying to hold the line, in which the outcome can depend on influence, personality, and collusion among factions more than on actual content. Just as the economy muddles along aided by endemic corruption, so cultural life profits from illicit alliances between writers, editors, or theater directors and their sympathizers and patrons among the politically powerful. Sometimes sheer luck blesses a work of art so that to everyone's amazement it breaks through the labyrinth of controls, as with The Red Snowball Tree, one of the best recent Soviet movies, which created a cultural sensation in the spring of '74. It was written, directed, and starred in by Vasily Shukshin, a tall, lanky, diamond-in-the-rough writer-director with the squint-eyed toughness of a Jack Palance, and a reputation for short stories that sympathetically portray rough country folk and even criminals. Its artistic excellence impressed many people. I knew, but beyond that, all were astonished at how many rules it broke. Not only did it put pimps, leggy hussies, and underworld thugs on the Soviet screen, but its hero was an ex-convict who wavered between going straight and lapsing into habitual criminality before he was brutally bumped off by his old gang. Its country characters, from a drunken collective farm chairman to the hero's aging mother forced to live on a pitiful 20-ruble monthly pension, were richly authentic. In one scene, Shukshin dared show the total boredom of people at a compulsory political lecture. In others, my friends were intrigued to see icons in the corners of rural homes or the ruins of Russian churches, fleeting but unusual allusions to the persecution of religious faith as well as its hold among the peasantry. As a rural romanticist, Shukshin had his hero kissing the Russian birches while the camera lovingly caressed the flowing rivers and rambling fields of the Russian countryside. A good-hearted countrywoman helped the ex-con try to go straight, and toward the end he was getting a grip on a tractor, but the film's whole thrust, crime growing in the supposedly pure soil of communist society, the hero's tragic ending, doubts about the perfectibility of man, and the clear implication that it was the depravity of modern city life which had made a good country boy go bad, all ran counter to the canons of Soviet socialist realism. Word quickly spread among Moscow intellectuals that Shukshin had battled a couple of years to get the film cleared, and that some of the best scenes had been cut by censors. In the public version that I saw, jumps and omissions were raggedly evident. Still, enough had survived to leave people asking how this film had managed to appear at all when so many others, reputedly less daring, had been blocked. Some knowledgeable Muscovites I knew speculated that Shukshin had developed credit and good standing from earlier, more orthodox works, and that the film industry desperately needed an unusual, top-quality film to show at international competitions. Probably true, I thought, but not enough to explain the chorus of favorable reviews the film was getting in the Soviet press. Shukshin, who was lionized overnight, seemed to have someone smiling on him from on high, and it was not clear why. Months later, I was told by an intellectual with good friends at the party Central Committee that Shukshin's mystery fan was Brezhnev himself. My friend said that while censors were holding the Red Snowball Tree in limbo, Brezhnev had seen it at a private Kremlin showing and had been moved to tears by the authentic scenes of rural Russia, the well-told tragedy of the hero, and by the moving portrayal of simple people whose faith in Russia was unshaken by their hard lives. Brezhnev's tears, my friend said, guaranteed the film's success. It was not the kind of explanation that could be positively confirmed, but it was plausible, and it illustrates the capriciousness with which the Soviet system sometimes operates. Sadly, Shukshin died within months of his great success. I never met Shukshin, but I did meet another author who has helped to overcome the queasiness of censors by high-level patronage. Chinji's Atamatov, an unusual communist writer who was praised both by Brezhnev and some dissident intellectuals. With 4 other American journalists, I was traveling in Central Asia in spring of '74, and all of us wanted to meet Atamatov because of his reputation as a liberal writer. When we tried to arrange an official interview with him during our visit to his hometown of Franz, we were given the runaround. Luckily, we managed to contact him directly, and he took the risk of graciously inviting us to his out-of-town dacha, a large, comfortable, well-furnished country home that would not have been out of place in the Burgess, Scarsdale, or Greenwich. He took us around his brick-walled garden, where he had lovingly gathered several old primitive stone statues of women, which he said had been done by Turkic artisans in the 6th century and had legendary or religious meaning. Atamatov, a husky, soft-spoken, middle-aged man of the hills whose dark eyebrows and oriental eyes immediately mark him as a Central Asian, is fascinated by the myths, legends, and remote history of his own people. Over a lavish heaping table of his wife's excellent Kyrgyz cooking, he talked to us with feeling deep into the night about mankind's common problems, of protecting nature, of industrialists, both East and West, who misuse it, and of betrayals of man by man from Richard III to the Soviet present. When someone observed that both he and Solzhenitsyn were concerned with themes of betrayal, he did not disagree but said, "Each sees it in his own way, each depicts it in his own way." Later he criticized Solzhenitsyn in keeping with the party line and backed away from open discussion of the penalties imposed against iconoclastic writers. To the party leadership, Atamatov is a convenient success story for the Soviet policy toward minority nationalities, because coming from Kyrgyzia and writing in Russian, he represents a minority writer who has hit the top. As such, he is a rarity celebrated by the party in its struggling effort to weld minority groups more firmly to their union with Russia. His political credentials, moreover, are impeccable. His parents were high-level Kyrgyz Communist Party activists, and joining the party practically as a matter of inheritance. Atamatov himself was rapidly advanced by the party as one of its leading representatives among intellectuals. In early years, his well-crafted but fairly conventional fiction set in the Kyrgyz mountains won him state prizes and formal recognition. As a mature writer, he has made his compromises, leaving certain things unsaid or going along with collective denunciation of a dissident like Andrei Sakharov. But in recent years, he has won a liberal following by using his protected position to write more unorthodox works on moral issues that lesser writers shy away from. The liberal wing of the intelligentsia took it as their victory when in 1970 he published The White Steamer, a novel. It was a moving allegory of good and evil in which a 7-year-old boy commits suicide in protest over the rape of nature by modern man, symbolized by the killing of a prized mountain deer. Conservatives protested that the boy's mood and suicide was too pessimistic for Soviet literature. Atamatov's next challenge to establishment conservatives came in 1973. He co-authored a play, The Ascent of Fujiyama, which raised for the first time in several years the moral guilt of people who had secretly betrayed others by informing on them in the Stalinist era. In keeping with the rules of the game, Atamatov avoided explicit mention of Stalin or the purges. He chose for his setting the picnic reunion of 4 old wartime friends who spend their outing haunted by the lingering mystery which of them had secretly denounced a missing colleague whose life was ruined as a consequence. Tell the truth, Atamatov's most attractive characters keep saying to each other and to the sympathetic audience. In an implied reproach of the establishment, his 2 most negative characters are rapaciously successful careerists, a world-traveling journalist, and the director of a scientific institute. I found the play stronger in theme than in dramatic finesse, but the mere treatment of such issues as personal betrayal, dishonesty, and the allusions to Stalinist repressions were daring and unusual enough for the Soviet stage to keep the audience at the edge of its seats on the night I saw the play. Atamatov's position is not so impregnable that he does not occasionally pay for his independence. I was told that he was officially reprimanded for having agreed to see our group without getting official permission, and as a result was banned from traveling abroad for about a year. But later, when Washington's Arena stage put on Fujiyama in translation, he was allowed to come to America for purposes of detente. The party found in him a useful image. On other occasions, the balance in the game of cat and mouse is tipped in favor of the intelligentsia by the attention and pressures of the outside world. In 1970, for example, the Cannes Film Festival awarded a prize to Andrei Rublev, a merciless, realistic film about the sufferings of medieval Russia seen through the life and art of Andrei Rublev, a legendary 15th century monk and icon painter. Filmed in the naturalistic style of Ingmar Bergman by Andrei Tarkovsky, Moscow's most talented film director, the movie was intended for release in '67 as part of the 50th anniversary celebrations of the Bolshevik Revolution, but its vivid portrayal of the violent Mongol conquest, the internecine fighting among Russians, the mass nudity of a pagan Midsummer Night's Festival, and its admiring representation of Rublev's religious art, and his urge for creative freedom in a hostile environment of informers and authoritarian rule, all ran afoul of censors. For 4 years, they held back the film, chopping away scenes while the movie was being marketed in the West, earning hard currency and a reputation for Soviet culture. Eventually, the international recognition at Cannes evidently provided such an embarrassment that Soviet authorities felt they could no longer hold back the film from their own people. A cut version was released to a few theaters in Moscow and then given a modest run around the country. An even more striking reversal, thanks to detente, was the change in official policy in the fall of '74, when a group of unofficial artists, none of them members of the Artist Union, tried to stage an outdoor art show in Moscow for the nonconformist and mildly abstract paintings. When they gathered in an open lot on September 15th, they were brutally dispersed by plainclothes police dressed as workers and operating bulldozers and dump trucks to scatter the artist and several hundred friends, foreign diplomats, and correspondents. My Times colleague Chris Wren was beaten up and had a tooth broken when police goons assaulted several newsmen. Other onlookers were arrested and interrogated. More than a dozen paintings were seized, torn, and tossed into a dump truck with other debris. Some of my artist friends said they saw paintings burned as well. The artists were quick to exploit and publicize this overkill by the authorities. The resulting international outcry, recalling Nazi book burning, caused the Kremlin to reverse the tactic of repression. While high-level journalists privately tried to blame the whole affair on Moscow party officials rather than higher-ups, though my own hunch is that it was fairly high-level conservatives who had ordered the crackdown. Ultimately, permission was given for an outdoor exhibition near Izmailovo Park a couple of weeks later on September 29th. This was easily the most unusual cultural event during my years in Moscow. Russians themselves were amazed by it. More than 10,000 people gathered in a huge open field on a gorgeous sunny Sunday afternoon. The air was festive, the atmosphere astonishingly free in spite of KGB cameramen with fancy Japanese equipment photographing Russians who dared to mingle openly with Western correspondents. It was, as one French diplomat remarked, a Russian Woodstock, a grand outdoor happening, more important because the authorities had felt compelled to let it take place or lose face internationally, than for the intrinsic merit of the art exhibited. Among the 200 canvases exhibited by 65 artists, I saw styles ranging from whimsical realism and religious symbolism to surrealism, pop art, coloristic abstractions, or the acid art of the psychedelic era. Along with more conventional painting, few artists showed their most far-out works. They didn't want to spoil things by going too far. The crowds edged cheerfully across the field, studying the canvases. People scrambled up and down ditches, held children aloft on their shoulders, applauded some artists, heckled others, and argued into the evening. After the canvases were gone, whether a painting should be considered art if the common man could not understand it. The entire scene was very un-Soviet. By world standards, the art was pretty tame. Several of the more prominent underground artists, like Oscar Robin, Vladimir Nemakin, and Lydia Masterkova, had for years been discreetly allowed by authorities to show and sell paintings privately to foreign diplomats. The art which reached the West had caused only mild interest, and then chiefly because it emanated from the Soviet Union, but violated the canons of socialist realism in either modernistic style or ironic content. It was certainly far less striking and daring than the work of the Russian avant-garde of the 20s, and generally less abstract or modernistic than graphic art long shown in the Soviet Baltics. The art is not what was most important, an experienced Moscow literary critic remarked to me a few days later. I saw only one or two paintings that I thought were good. It was the atmosphere I liked, the sense of freedom. It made me proud to be a Russian for once, just to be there. The underground artists exploited the international attention they had won and pressed for other, smaller exhibits. At times the authorities gave way, and at other times played upon differences among the artists to contain them. A year after the first big show, the artists insisted on having another big exhibition, this time with close to 800 works, and when some conservative officials took down 41 of them, the artist created another furor by threatening to shut down the entire exhibit and informing the Western press. Again, fearing an international scandal, higher, more pragmatic officials gave way, allowing some paintings to be returned and barring only the ones with obvious political import. It was a good Philistine reaction, commented an American official. The Soviet authorities seem to think that if they leave it alone, the novelty of this stuff will wear off and it will go away. Probably they are right, for though this group of painters had cleverly made the most of their opening, there was no evidence that the party was relaxing controls on the mainstream of Soviet art. Sometimes the watchdogs of culture are simply outplayed on their own territory because of competition among the more liberal magazine editors who are desperate for readable material to spice up the volumes of predictable propaganda they are obliged to run. The science fiction fantasies of the Strugatsky brothers, Boris and Arkady, for example, are widely read by the cognoscenti as critical allegories about Soviet Russia. Set on other planets or in the West, in predatory things of the epoch, the Strugatskys projected a future society where material needs were met, but people were overcome with boredom and a spiritual vacuum. In its Difficult to Be God, an Earth expedition to another planet witnesses a religiously inspired coup d'etat and the setting up of a medieval fascist society with features quite recognizable to Russian readers. Their fantasy, The Snail on a Slope, offered so telling a caricature of the useless paperwork, inefficiency, and uncaring hypocrisy of Soviet bureaucrats represented by the fictional Office of Forest Affairs that Pravda attacked the work as a libel and defamation of Soviet reality, and the Strugatskys ran into serious problems getting published after that. Soviet intellectuals take delight in spotting and sharing any such items that slip past the censors. One of the most stunning goofs occurred when Yevgeny Markin published a symbolic poem, Weightlessness, in New World magazine in late '71, and used it as an allegory to repent for having joined the official campaign to expel Solzhenitsyn from the Russian Writers' Union. But when that interpretation of the poem became common gossip among Moscow intellectuals, the game was over and retribution was swift. I was told that the responsible censors and editors were reprimanded, and Markin himself was thrown out of the Writers' Union for his poetic heresy and thereby denied a living as a writer. The theater, probably more than any other medium, lends itself to the duel between artist and censor, which is a prime reason why drama was the most lively and popular of the Soviet arts in the early 70s. I knew Russians who would come home relishing the extra meanings. They had read into nuances, inflections, and gestures. They would go to plays and wait for those few lines or that single soliloquy that titillated them, forgiving the rest of the performance for being pedestrian or orthodox. Rock and Roll at Dawn, for example, was an anti-American Soviet musical written by two Pravda editors who used a few recorded tunes from Jesus Christ Superstar and an American ambience as a come-on. Its portrayal of the United States essentially fit the cliché Soviet view of American society as money-grubbing, immoral, bent on the arms race, intriguing with the Chinese, and repressive toward its idealistic youth. But this gambit did manage to get Superstar officially accepted, and toward the end, when a police detective protested to his chief about lying among officialdom, the director got off a commentary on Soviet life by having his actor face the Soviet audience and declare, "We lie, level by level, I lie to you, you lie to your chief, and he lies to the very top. A pyramid of lies. What holds it up, I don't know. Perhaps it is built on the fear that someone will get out of the pyramid and it will collapse. But sometime all this must end. I personally am quitting the game. At the premiere of the play, which I saw, that was an electric moment. The police detective was saying something intellectuals would only say in private, but not outside a trusted group. To have pulled it off in public was a real coup. Written about America, of course, it was innocent enough, but delivered full face to the Russian audience. It was pregnant with meaning. The audience, savoring it fully, responded with strong applause. So prone are Russians to read significance into every art form that they can find political overtures even in musical performances. In December 1972, Mstislav Rostropovich was under a ban against foreign travel and was severely restricted in his home concerts. The Kremlin, angered over his giving refuge in his home to Alexander Solzhenitsyn, nonetheless permitted him to appear several evenings during the Moscow Winter Festival of the Arts. One highlight was his performance of a new composition by Poland's leading composer, Witold Litoslawski, written especially for Rostropovich. By Moscow standards, it was very modern, dissonant, unorthodox. Rostropovich took the precaution of rehearsing it discreetly with the orchestra only a few times before performing it at the Moscow Conservatory, a favorite haven of the liberal intelligentsia. Russian friends of mine who saw the performance interpreted it as more than the bold airing of provocatively modern music. They saw it as deliberate statement of the cellist's and the composer's philosophy. In several passages, the lone lyrical voice of Rostropovich, his cello, struggled to be heard against a crashing and cacophonous orchestra. To Rostropovich's friends and enthusiasts, the message was that of a free and unbowed musical and intellectual spirit struggling to make himself heard against the din of cultural orthodoxy and in spite of official censure of his behavior. One favorite ploy of leading liberal theaters is to perform unchallengeable classics, but give them a modern twist that makes them more politically potent than anything contemporary Soviet dramatist could get away with. Yuri Lyubimov, the talented and imaginative director of Moscow's Tangaka Theater, is a past master of this technique. His version of Hamlet, with the players in modern slacks and turtleneck sweaters, and the grave diggers unmistakably cast as Russian peasants, put the atmosphere of medieval Danish intrigues and eavesdropping into a Soviet setting. To add to the Russianness, Lyubimov had one actor read as a prologue Boris Pasternak's poem about Hamlet from the still-banned novel Dr. Zhivago. His Hamlet, moreover, is no self-doubting prince, but an enraged young man struggling against an evil ruler in an evil time, King Claudius as Stalin. This rendering was sufficiently touchy for Lyubimov, to have had to fight hard for permission to stage it. I was fairly new to Moscow when I saw it, and was uncertain how much to read into it. After the performance, I asked Lyubimov how deliberately he had pointed his Hamlet at the Soviet present. Still playing the game in order to protect himself, he answered me elliptically, "The play is a classic because it is so eternal. If it ever stops sounding contemporary, if it does not stir a contemporary response, if it does not make people think about themselves, there is no point in playing it." He paused to make sure I'd gotten his meaning, and then illustrated his point with the to be or not to be speech. In his version, it is less a philosophical soliloquy than a moral sermon to the audience not to cooperate with evil, given twice over for emphasis. Hamlet is a very decent man, severe in criticizing himself for an action. Lyubimov said, "He is afraid of death. We are all afraid of death, of losing careers, of the unknown. That is why we tolerate evil." The most cunning dramatic exercise in double entendres that I saw in Moscow, however, was Balalaikhin and Company, which many intellectuals I knew took as a deliciously apt and funny commentary on their lives. The timid silence of the intelligentsia, their fawning fear of the police and political authority, their turning to walks, to feasting, and to drinking as a substitute for intellectual freedom and activity, their penchant for philosophizing during drunken bouts, and their inaction afterward, their compulsion for hiding the flaws of Russian life from foreigners, the double talk they used to appease the powers that be, their readiness to toady the authority. What especially piqued the fancy of Moscow intellectuals was that this provocative satire was written by Sergei Mikhailov, the lumbering millionaire children's writer, known as a leader among the conservative watchdogs of the literary scene. The fact that Mikhailov would author a play like Balalaikhin is one of those Soviet paradoxes that made it difficult for me ever to be confident of characterizing someone as an unreconstructed hardliner. It prompted endless gossip among other intellectuals. Some of my friends saw the play as proof of the supreme ideological cynicism of which they had long suspected Mikhailov. Others said they had heard he had been pushed into doing the play because his liberal-minded sons had challenged him to produce something honest and daring. I often wondered whether one of his sons had actually written it and had gotten his father to front for him. The cover for Balalaikhin was that it was a dramatic adaptation of the novel, a modern idyll, by the great 19th century Russian satirist Mikhail Saltykov-Shchedrin. As a precaution, the Sovremennik Theatre, which presented the play, hoisted a huge banner over the stage which read, "It is impossible to understand the history of Russia in the second half of the 19th century without the help of Shchedrin." Stage and costuming were from the last century, but all that only made my Russian friends enjoy the entire spectacle even more as a spoof on their own lives. It opens with two liberal intellectuals who have just heard the warning, as if in a modern Soviet crackdown, to keep quiet and wait. No reason is given, but the two men retreat indoors, give up all liberal activities and contacts, and sit quietly in the drawing room, devoid of resistance. The contemporary audience is right at home with them. If you try to hide somewhere, they will find out, cautions one of the men. They will find you and ask what you are doing. Even innocent people will become guilty. Like Russians today, the two men start whispering to each other for fear of being overheard, even though they are saying nothing of consequence. The main thing is to fight the wildness of the spirit, affirms the first pompously. We will surprise the world with our lack of action and the purity of our sentiments, echoes the second. Gradually their lives lose content and meaning. They drink, eat, sit in silence, stare at each other, talk nonsense, go for long walks, and then, in the ritualistic phrase of so many Russians today, proudly proclaim to each other, "We have everything." When a police informer appears, they purposely lose to him at cards, to ingratiate themselves. When the forbidding chief of police appears, they quake in terror, mask their opinions in double talk, and begin echoing his comments. Quite willingly they make themselves his tools. Staged by Leningrad's masterful director Georgy Tovstonogov, Balalakin is beautifully played, richly appreciated by the intelligentsia for portraying their predicament, and privately mistrusted by party conservatives. A leading journalist told me that Mikhailokov's satire struck so close to home that in spite of the author's exalted position, he was called on the carpet by the Communist Party Central Committee to explain why he had produced a work with so many anti-Soviet innuendos, but Mikhailikov proved himself a masterful tactician. According to the journalist's account, he insisted that this was Shchedrin writing about Tsarist times, and he was surprised that party officials would read anti-Soviet sentiments into it. On this occasion he was let go, but he was summoned again later. The journalist told me that this time Mikhailikov went armed with citations from Tsarist officials who had roundly denounced Shchedrin for the original work, so that when the party officials censored Mikhailikov, he quoted the parallel comments of Tsarist officialdom. That, the journalist told me, proved to be an effective rebuttal, and Balalakin survived. The political and intellectual tension over Balalakin and similar works of art, commented Gala, a middle-aged Moscow linguist and playwright, is what gives our cultural life pockets of vitality. In the West, everything is possible, and so almost nothing is desperately precious. In Russia, almost nothing of great merit is possible, and so anything of value is immensely treasured. The choice of good books is so small that you appreciate every single one of them. I know a man who used to carry his favorite books around with him: Pasternak, Mandelstam, Atamatov. When he visited America, he was overwhelmed to see stacks of Mandelstam in bookstores. At first he was impressed by how many copies were available, and then he was depressed that no one was buying them. He told me I could not live in a country where Mandelstam was not properly appreciated. Gala was right. Russian intellectuals do keenly prize artistic excellence, because they are so starved for it, and this unstinting appreciation is one of the most attractive features of Soviet cultural life. They are like the Soviet consumers who display newlywed excitement about some modest new purchase that would be taken for granted in the West. Russian intellectuals treasure any unusual poetry reading, concert, or foreign film, and talk about it for months afterwards as a major event in their lives. I remember one morning in Tbilisi coming upon a line of people half a block long and learning from some of them that they were waiting for a bookstore to open because they had heard that a new volume of Dostoevsky's writings was going on sale. Many were the evenings that Anne and I sat among enraptured audiences at the Moscow Conservatory. where the music was superb, and where, as one Moscow friend said, I can find refuge from our politicized life. The intelligentsia would come unpretentiously in their plain sweaters and slacks and warmly cheer their local heroes, Shostakovich, Oistrakh, Rostropovich, Reiter, Khachaturian. Modern atonal trends were all but forbidden, but these Russians were thrilled to savor Tchaikovsky, Borodin, Rimsky-Korsakov, and other classics. In spite of its limited repertoire and the constant foreign tours of its stars, the Bolshoi could sometimes be a place of excitement, especially when some leading ballerina like Plistakaya was dancing. Both inside the hall and outside, the crowds were electrified. Whether Plistakaya was a liquid, graceful black swan or wry, angular bullfighter's maul in Carmen Suite, the bouquets would shower down from the balconies. Nor were these mere cultural diversions and a flood of offerings as they might be in New York, London, or Paris. These were rare treats, and Russians absorbed each one of them as an occasion to be remembered. Nonetheless, many of the intellectuals I knew regarded high points like the underground art show, Voznesensky's rare poetry readings, or balalaikin as sporadic titillations, flowers in a cultural dessert, piecemeal sops from the authorities. To them, the caricature of intellectual life and balalaikin, though an exaggeration, was all too painfully appropriate for the early Soviet 70s. The ferment and excitement of the Khrushchev thaw in the late 50s and early 60s had kindled hopes for real long-term cultural relaxation and freedom. But in the retrenchment that followed the invasion of Czechoslovakia, Soviet intellectuals found their own cultural climate sterile. Individual stories, plays, readings flashed momentarily from time to time because since Stalin's death, the party felt the need to allow safety valves in order to enlist gifted writers and other intellectuals in its cause, with the offer of some flexibility, though it curbed their most rebellious proclivities. My liberal intellectual friends admired not only Shukshin, Atamatov, and Tarkovsky among their contemporaries, but to name only a few of the others, Vasil Bykov, with his unorthodox picture of the aimless brutality of World War II, Vasil Iskander, with his sardonic short reminiscent of William Saroyan, and Yuri Trifonov, with his trenchant tales of Philistinism, of the rising middle class, or Fyodor Abramov, with his realistic portrayal of the hard life and the degenerating moral values of the Russian countryside, but the focus of each was limited and narrow, their treatment more subtle than daring. For the first half of the 70s lacked the thrust, direction, and above all, the sense of community and hope of the Khrushchev era. There were 10 years of my life, 55 through 65, when I thought that today is not so good, but tomorrow will be better. Gala, the playwright, told me, for others maybe this went on a bit longer, a bit later, but for me these 10 years had a very nice feeling. I felt it was possible to be published eventually. I wrote things that could not be published at the time, but I thought this was temporary and they would be published later. But then the trial of Sinyavitsky and Daniel in 1966 was like a crash. Others had their own crash later. The 6-Day War, Czechoslovakia, it got harder to publish. We lost hope. Under Khrushchev, what was known as the Tribune of Poets, Yevtushenko, Voznesensky, Bela Akhmadulina, Robert Rozhdestvensky, fired the imagination of the young. New theaters like Tanganka and Sovremennik burst into life. Periodically Khrushchev would scold and rein in the liberals, but his erratic lurches of policy and his de-Stalinization campaign provided flexibility that could be exploited more readily by the intelligentsia than the grayer, more controlled atmosphere of Brezhnev's Russia in the year after Czechoslovakia. Probably the most painful setback to literary liberals was the forced removal in the early 1970 of Alexander Tvardovsky as chief editor of New World magazine, long a liberal beacon. It was Tvardovsky himself, a successful and ironic poet, who had discovered Solzhenitsyn and most other unorthodox writers. New World was finished as a magazine when Tvardovsky was removed. A successful satirist lamented to me, "If you had read it for 10 years while he was editor, you could have learned much about Soviet life, but after that, not much." He was a wonderful editor. He suffered greatly for that magazine and for his writers. He printed much that without him would never have seen the light of day. This man told me that when he had tried to put together a book of collected articles, recently the censors blocked the most daring ones, although they had been published earlier by Tvardovsky. This sense of retrenchment in the early 70s was felt by many others with whom I talked. Writers Lydia Tchaikovskaya and Vladimir Voinovich were kicked out of the Writers' Union for supporting Solzhenitsyn or publishing works abroad that the authorities found offensive, like Voinovich's Ivan Chonkin, a satire bumbling inefficiency of the Soviet bureaucracy and the army, which the author tried vainly to publish in Moscow for a decade. Other writers privately complained of what had been cut from works of theirs that did appear. Never judge what a Soviet writer thinks by what appears in his books, a middle-aged dramatist bitterly warned me one evening. We have all learned to submit to censorship, and what is worse, to censor ourselves. You and your heroic New York Times wouldn't be so brave if you knew that the price of exposing Nixon or of editorials your government doesn't like was exile to Siberia or being blacklisted for life. When you see people here getting excited over Atamatov or someone else, it is because he has found a way to eke out a bit more honesty than usual. But it is a matter of degree only. If someone manages to be 20 or 30% honest about our life, it is considered a sensation. For someone in Moscow publishing house, I heard of another writer who was ordered to cut offensive allusions from a science fiction story by the Strogatsky brothers to meet the objections of book censors. The man, who was a friend of the author's, hated the task but reasoned that he would probably be gentler and more sympathetic than someone who did not care. It was either cut or not be published, and the Strogatskys needed the money, the publishing official said. In 1971, when I first met Yuri Yeblimov, the Taganaka theater director, he enthusiastically ticked off 3 plays, then in rehearsal, Guard Your Faces, a theatrical review by Vozhnetsky that had been shut down in 1970 by censors after 2 performances, an unorthodox play by Boris Mozayev about an independent-minded farm who wants to do the unthinkable, quit his collective farm, and a theatrical adaptation of Mikhail Bulgakov's satirical fantasy, The Master and Margarita. But none of these cleared the censors, in the next 3 seasons. At Moscow Art Theater, I was told objections of politically conservative party members in the troupe blocked an interesting and unconventional drama about Pushkin, Tsar Nicholas I. A movie scenarist told me that probably 10 or a dozen movies were stopped each year after being filmed, not to mention numerous scripts rejected before filming on political grounds. Not only liberal writers like Fazil Iskander, but established conservatives like Mikhail Sholokhov, I was told, had large chunks of works removed because of allusions the watchdogs disapproved of. The editors of the conservative youth monthly, Young Guard, I heard from one former editor, suppressed a whole flood of manuscripts dealing openly with sex, pacifist sentiments, or cynicism among youth about military service. Westerners often picture a single censor in a publishing house ferreting out the unacceptable works, but Russian writers describe to me a much more complex process. Frequently, they fear censors less than their editors, who are anxious to protect themselves from political repercussions, and thus inclined to do vigorous pre-censoring and cutting. One internationally known poet, angry about the New York Times characterization of one of his works as stridently anti-American, took me to lunch and explained for 5 hours the labyrinth of checks which had whittled away what he claimed was his most interesting material and left him with a naked propaganda piece. For 18 months he bleated, he dragged himself to a committee for the Russian Republic's Ministry of Culture, to the All-Union Ministry of Culture, to a district Communist Party committee, to the ideological section of the Moscow Party Committee, and to the Culture Ministry's administration of theaters to get his script okayed, all before it even went to Glavlit, the official censorship agency. At just one of the preliminary stages, he groaned, they made 100 changes. I counted them myself, and they promised that was all they would do, but it wasn't. They did more later. More than one writer observed to me, however, that it was the attraction of big royalties, large editions, and big audiences, or of country dashas, and the chance to travel abroad and other perquisites, as much as censorship, that has brought off many would-be liberals. Ideological stalwarts who write patriotic themes are usually the most richly rewarded. Vadim Kazavenikov, an author of many war novels and Cold War spy thrillers, some picked up by movies and television, had reputedly piled up a 1 million ruble fortune. Other writers have bargained for much less, but the materialist mood of the 70s had affected many. Who's going to worry about daring poetry, quipped one successful poet, when he's anxious to get in line for a new Ziguli car? By the early 70s, all kinds of people were complaining privately that the liberal poets of the 60s had lost their fire. Yevtunchenko, with his lean-limbed, self-serving charm, had become a poetic huckster for the regime, chanting civic verses of Soviet loyalty, attacking the Chinese or the Chilean junta. Rozdestevensky was writing pop tunes or rhapsodizing about space heroes and construction projects. Voznesensky had surrendered the clear ring of youth and retreated into more cautious, complex, and stifled protest. Akhmadulina had trouble getting into print at all. That difficulty plagued others, like the Strogatsky brothers, with their politicized science fiction, or Vasily Aksyonov, a leader of the youth prose movement in the early 60s. Worse, I kept hearing the only interesting writing in the 70s came from the Khrushchev generation, now in middle age, and the younger generation of the 70s had not produced any striking new talent or writers, with a dash of disobedience to replace the older ones. You have to be someone already to get away with saying anything at all, shrewdly observed one literary critic in his 20s. Nowadays, daring youth writers are crushed before they get started, added an older man privately. Voznesenski acknowledged that he could never have gotten a liberal start and reputation in the conservative climate of the 70s. Moreover, Soviet cultural life was being drained of vitality and its characteristic talent. Not only was Solzhenitsyn forcibly ejected from the country, but other important writers went into exile. Joseph Brodsky, perhaps the most talented living Russian poet, Viktor Nekrasov, celebrated author of In the Trenches of Stalingrad, Andrei Sinyasky, a brilliant literary critic and distant satirist, and Vladimir Maximov, a strident dissident novelist, among others. A sense of cultural claustrophobia drove inventive, creative intellectuals in other fields to exile as well. Mstislav Rostropovich, tired of the official quarantine imposed on him for supporting Solzhenitsyn, and went west with his wife, the operatic singer Galina Vishnevskaya, in order to recapture his artistic career. Even such a non-political figure as young Mikhail Berezhnikov, the leading dancer of Leningrad's Kirov Ballet, and one of the most privileged of all artists in the Soviet Union, defected in Canada in '74 and later let it be known that it was the deadening cultural conservatism that drove him out. He had wanted in Leningrad to dance Schoenberg and Warburg, but the ideological committee of the Ministry of Culture had ruled out such modern classics as not suitable for ballet. Valerie Panov, another Kirov star, mounted his campaign to immigrate for the same kind of reason. These cases illustrate not only the stifling cultural controls, but the stodginess of the entire cultural environment in its public cultural life. Today, the Soviet Union as a nation has opted out on most of the cultural development of the 20th century. Abstract art, modern dance, stream of consciousness prose. Dmitry Shostakovich stood until his recent death practically alone as an important composer in the medium of 12-tone music, and this from a nation which overwhelmed the world with the richness of its musical as well as literary outpouring in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Today, the Bolshoi Ballet and the Soviet symphony orchestras, for all their technical magnificence, and they are a treat to see and hear, are still performing essentially 19th century repertoires. In literature and drama as well, it is the 19th century classics that set the standard. The common denominator of contemporary Soviet culture is still banal. Propagandistic factory drama like Steelworkers, put on by the Moscow Art Theater, home of Chekhov and Stanislavski. The plot of Steelworkers revolves around who will become the new leader of a work brigade in a steel mill. Its most dramatic moment occurs when the curtain parts to reveal 4 blast furnaces roaring realistically at the rear of the stage. As I was leaving Moscow, the most widely promoted movie was The Hottest Month, another steel plant saga where the drama focused on whether the plan could be fulfilled. The biggest book editions go to stories of youth joyously marching off to the draft or to construction projects in Siberia, communist patriots heroically fighting off the whites during the Russian Civil War, or heroically written war stories about the struggle against the fascists. The brilliant stagecraft of such theater directors as Yuri Yebimov at Taganka Theatre, Anatoly Yevros and Mayala Bronaya Theatre, or Georgy Tovstonogov at Leningrad's Gorky Theatre, and their new interpretations of the classics diverts attention from the paucity of modern dramatic talent. In literature, people burrow into the 19th century writers, one well-read engineer commented, because they are so much better, more honest, more revealing than anything that is being written today. All this Yevtushchenko, Vosnesenski, Shukshin doesn't interest me. A university co-ed, an enthusiast of the classics, told me of the real panic in a Russian prose class at Moscow State University, when the professor announced an upcoming test on literary style based on recognition of unidentified passages from contemporary writers supposedly read outside of class. I haven't read any modern Soviet authors in 3 years, she moaned, and neither have my friends. A slight exaggeration, perhaps, but her disinterest and that of other young people in contemporary Soviet writing was genuine. So tame and disappointing did some young people find the muffled art of the Soviet establishment liberals in the early 70s that they would hungrily ask for any Western writing, almost regardless of quality, both because it was exotic and unrestrained. I heard other intellectuals more radical complain that the liberals were doing a disservice because they were playing with half-truths and pulling their punches while pretending to speak out daringly. Ironically, it was Volnenitsky who captured this turned-off mood of the young, as well as expressing his own frustrations in some laconic ruminations, which he published in '72, called As an Ironic Treatise on Boredom. Boredom is a fast of the spirit, it is a solitary supper, the carousing of your enemies is boring, and your comrade is doubly boring. Art lies, thought is scant, impotent rhymes are boring, and your darling is as boring as a whore who plays the nun. A great fast of the spirit, the applauding audiences are boring.